Hello, my name is Brant, and the last name is Hunt. That is, today is the 30th of January, 2021. And I wanted to talk about, I studied Russian history in college. I had a good professor. My professor was from Lithuania, which is very odd, especially when you go to school, you go to college, that is, and you visit, the school, and there's a Lithuanian, and most people say, "What's that?" In other words, is that some kind of disease? So Lithuania is a country. It's part of the Baltic states, as one time Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I just wanted to share with you that part. But the the other part that my professor never told me about was the war that the Soviet Union had with the Finnish. And it was a very short war, and it was a joke. The Finns basically were outnumbered 20 to 1 and still managed to hold almost all the ground that they had. They did lose some territory. Um, and this occurred in late September of 1939. I'm sorry, not late September, late November 1939. The war only drug on for only 3 months after during the World War II, and ended 3 months, 3.5 months later. There was a peace treaty that was signed in March 13th, 1940. Interesting thing simply was that the Finns were basically outnumbered in so many ways. Their total tanks that were involved in the war were 32. That's right, 32. Meanwhile, uh, they had 114 aircraft. Now, I want to tell you how bad the Russian army was in many ways and how they messed up here. So they had over 2,500 to 6,000 tanks compared to the 32 tanks that the Finns had. And they had over 3,800 airplanes. But you'll find out simply is they mismanaged the whole war effort, that is the Russians. And so you ask me, how did this get started? In other words, why did this take place? Well, what took place was that the, the hold on a second here. The Soviets were making demands, and they wanted the Finlands to cede substantial border territories in exchange for land elsewhere, claiming security reasons, primarily the protection of Leningrad from the Finnish border. And when Finland said no, the Soviet Union invaded. Most sources conclude that the Soviet Union had intended to conquer all of Finland and use the establishment of the puppet government, that is the Finnish Communist government, to take over. But that didn't take place. The Finns repelled the Soviet attack for more than 2 months and inflicted substantial losses on the invaders. And I'll explain the losses here, folks. This is unbelievable. The total dead that were killed during the war, the Finns lost approximately 26,000 people, that is dead. They also had over 43,000 wounded. And they lost, estimate from 20 to 30 tanks, and almost lost all their tanks and lost half of their aircraft, 62 that is. But look at the numbers for the Soviet Union here. It blows you away. This is unbelievable. Now, I said right around 25 to 26,000 people got killed, soldiers, by the Finnish loss. There was 126,875 to over 167,000 dead or missing. So let's just give it an estimate. Let's just go to medium range here of over 140,000 troops from the Soviet Union were dead or missing. That's astounding. that is this unbelievable when they had all this, heavy weaponry compared to the Finns. Not only that, there were over 188,000 to 200,000 wounded. So the Finns, this is amazing. We're talking about Goliath and David here. In fact, more than that. And so it's incredible that no one knows about this. And I know that I didn't know anything about it. And I remember reading about this, and it just simply was ineptitude. That is, the Soviet Union just simply kept making the same old blunders over and over again in this war. And eventually, they got to the point simply is, we're not getting anywhere here. And in reality, this shows how inept that the Soviet Union army was. Now remember, Stalin's in command here. And remember, he'd gotten rid of most of his generals that he were supposedly had far more experience in dealing with things in a war, or as soldiers. That is, they were not soldiers, but actually generals. He got rid of them. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why there are so many troops killed by the Finns with the Soviet Union. The other thing is simply the adage that people have to understand is that when you're in a defensive war, you basically fight differently than you do as the aggressor. And you know your territory, you know where the weak spots in your lines are, or where you need to hide, or whatever, such and such. The Soviet Union didn't know that. But the problem is simply is they were inept to generals. These people who were basically had never even been in command of anything, it seems like. And so what this whole thing does, though, the big picture is that Hitler looks and he's amidst this whole thing that's taking place, and he's saying, golly, this is a cakewalk. In other words, he saw simply how inept the Soviet Union was with the army. And most of you may not understand, there was a pact between Molotov and Ribbentrop pact, secret protocol that gave evidence they divided up Poland. You see, that is, I'm sorry, I was meant to say just Molotov was the one who negotiated with the Germans. I don't remember who the German was, but anyway, they divided Poland. Once the war started, they divided Poland, and so they were halfway between Poland was where the German army was on the Western Front, and the Eastern Front was where the Soviet Union troops were. So what we have to see here or understand is that Hitler must have examined and saw what was going on here, and said to himself, excuse me, they're talking about 20 to 30 to 1 odds here, and yet it should have been, if worse, a stalemate. But it wasn't a stalemate. And in reality, simply, is the Soviet Union lost a ton of men in this war. And it was only for 3 months. And they don't talk about this in history because it seems so short and so little, and yet, it's not important. But it is important, because what happens simply is that Hitler saw these things and eventually said that was for his plan to discover, to try to conquer the Soviet Union. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you tonight, little things about history that most people don't know about. So I hope you enjoyed it and appreciate it. And thank you for listening. And again, like I said, the Finns did have to cede approximately 10% of their land, but in reality, simply, as the Soviet Union is like, got completely embarrassed. And this wasn't the first time. Before World War One was taking place, before even the Bolsheviks came in power, the Japanese attacked the Russians, and the Japanese eventually won that battle against Russia. That was before World War One. That's before the Bolsheviks come to power. It was actually a way of diverting, trying to cause struggles for the Tsar in the Soviet Union. It was a way to get his eyes off of the Western area and to his east, to flank in that way. And the Japanese, most are unaware that the United States bankers paid Japan to do this. That's a fact. The bankers here in the United States paid the Japanese to attack, Russia at that point. Most are unaware simply is that the communists got an enormous amount of money from the bankers to set up the communists there, the Marxists. That's a fact. We have a book here that really gives facts to this. It's called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony C. Sutton. And he explains basically how much America was involved in these things and trying to destroy the Tsar. That is not the government per se, although Woodrow Wilson was involved in it, don't get me wrong. But this was the bankers. This was the bankers and the industrialists. They wanted this another type of war to take place. After all, that's how they make money. Many bankers do, is that they put money on both sides and they can't lose. You see, winner takes all per se, but they never lose in that perspective. Most people are not even aware of that, but that's what's been going on for the last 300 years, not longer. But Anthony C. Sutton does a book on this. He also writes a book. Anthony C. Sutton writes a book, 2 other books. He wrote a book to deal with how Hitler came to power. And again, it was the industrialists and the bankers who gave him money. You see how this is all set up, how they found their man Hitler and they supported him, and money started coming in. Because how did suddenly Germany get all the money? Well, it came from the industrialists. Henry Ford was involved with that, and the bankers. It's all about making money and making weapons. And the same thing took place in the Soviet Union, Russia, especially. This is all facts, folks. This is all facts. America is not some great little country over here. It's like innocent. No, we're involved immensely in all kinds of world's affairs. That is international studies, involved in all kinds of areas throughout the world, and have been for the last ever since 1880s, after what took place in 1871 here in the United States, that allowed suddenly that the laws were changed. That is, that you no longer as an individual had the power. In other words, you became a property of the state. It became a corporation. The United States did, although it originally was a corporation even at first. But in 1871, we see that with the whole issue of the District of Columbia. And this is why these things happen. They don't happen by accident. They're done on purpose, you see. And so, again, like I said, the Bolsheviks were set up, and then eventually the National Socialists under Hitler was set up also. It has come from money. We know that simply is some of the money was actually funneled through the American Red Cross in the Soviet Union, before it was, I should say, to Russia, but during the Marxists. Also, people are not aware simply is there was a war after, during Lenin's time, a couple of years after supposedly getting, in 1918, taking over the country. Within a year or 2 years, there was a civil war in Russia, Soviet Union now. And it was actually 4 different groups. When I was taught in school, it's just simply the Reds and Whites. But it was also the Greens and Blacks. There were many groups that were actually fighting to somehow alleviate the Bolsheviks. The whites were part of the Tsar, so they wanted the Tsar to come back in power. They wanted the oligarchy type of form of government. And the Bolsheviks were supported actually by Trotsky, and most were not aware that simply the United States and Britain sent troops to Russia during this time. Also, Woodrow Wilson did this, and we got a tail beat. In the Soviet Union at that time. In fact, especially at the battle that took place at Volnovakha. No, not Volnovakha. Near St. Petersburg is where it was at, and the United States lost. The Marines were there and lost, but we were there. So was the British. The British were involved also, but it was a mopping type of deal. In other words, it was a deal that simply there wasn't really what they would call putting all your effort into winning a war, supposedly getting rid of the communists. No, it was done in a way to show that we're against these guys, but in reality, the bankers and the industrialists were supporting this type of thing. So it was in some way saying, look, we're fighting against these guys. These are bad people. And yet, we lost. You see, it was just a way of actually, and we sent military weapons there. We sent ammunition there to support the whites, and I'm sure that the Greens and blacks were involved also, not as heavily as the whites were, but there were different areas where a part of the country. Soviet Union is a huge country, folks, and it's part of this was to destroy certain areas. In other words, groups have said, no, I don't like the way it is. I'm going to do something about it. So that was we'll talk more about that in the future too, with this whole issue. But most people are not aware of this. I mean, basically what it was, the deal was with the Japanese war with Russia, was to get the Tsars to move his troops in a certain situation to the east and to defend that flank, and he would have less troops on the west. And also simply is that it would cause more murmuring with the people, that is, and eventually overthrowing. One of the major reasons why the Tsar failed was that particular way. He wasn't implementing that. He didn't seem to be taking things seriously, or either he just was getting tired. And let me explain one other thing. When the Bolsheviks came to power, the Tsar was not even around. He wasn't there. He wasn't in the capital. He wasn't there. You see. So we know that simply the Tsar was one of the richest men in the world, and that he sent money to U.S. banks, two major U.S. banks, before he actually was captured by the Bolsheviks. And he also put some in a Swiss account too. He was the richest, what we know is he was probably the richest man in the world, not for sure in Russia, but probably in the world close to that. I don't know if the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds will probably be ahead of that, but as a czar, as a government official, so to speak, he had plenty of money, and he invested in a lot of things. So, but these things are critical for eventually. The other thing I pointed out when I did this series, I did a small series on this before, dealing with simply is that when the Kerensky government fell, which was the government trying to have what they call a democracy, supposed to be, during this time before the Bolsheviks took over in October and November of 1917. There was actually a March revolution that took place that same year, and it failed. And so what transpired later on is that they tried again, and this time Kerensky was out of the office, everything failed. So in other words, it's similar to the Duma, which was the government that at that time under the Russians. He had already given up substantial agreements to basically make it more free in Russia, that is the Tsar, and provided the government, instead of him just being the absolute power. It was too little, too late. He had already made too many enemies at that point, and it didn't work out for him. Now, I don't believe that his family were destroyed by the Bolsheviks. I believe it simply is I think they got away and were probably put in some kind of hiding, so to speak. So, but I could be wrong, but that's my thinking. There is some evidence that basically the Bolsheviks were told not to kill them, and they were too important. So, but anyway, I don't want to get into that right now. I just want to share some things about you about the Russian-Finnish War and how they were blown away by the Finns. It's interesting, isn't it? But a lot of that has to do with Stalin simply destroying his own generals. He didn't trust anyone. He's afraid of anybody that might have more power than he did. And so he eliminated his enemies, supposedly. Although they weren't his enemies most of the time, he saw them as enemies and he disposed of them. It's kind of critical. It's important for you to see that and understand how that lays line. And Stalin lives to the 1950s. Let's see, 53, I think it is. And then Khrushchev takes over at that point, and then Brezhnev later on in that power vacuum. So, and when Stalin does come to power, he didn't take any prisoners. He doesn't play games. Even though Lenin passed away, Trotsky was his right-hand man. Trotsky lost out. But Trotsky, I think, was thinking he was going to become the next power broker there, and that failed, and he had to run for his life. And eventually he was killed by Stalin's henchmen in Mexico. And when you think about that, Stalin was that type of person. Very brutal person, very brutal. But anyway, I appreciate you listening. I just wanted to share your little short history on the Russian-Finn War. And I wish you a good night, and you take care. Thank you.